introduce myself, I'm Mike O'Brien. Having got that logo, and that's the only accurate introduction you're going to get, my topic is just the Australian literature. And Australians are big players in Vietnam, let's face it. And the Australian literature represents a small pillar, not even a large pillar. And the literature internationally is growing exponentially, particularly in the United States. So forgive me if I talk about Australian literature. But let me raise a couple of issues first of all. Thanks. Next. Is non-fiction literature? Because most of the stuff written about the Vietnam War, with some exceptions, is non-fiction. Certainly up there that there's little credit given to non-fiction writers. Perhaps they should be given more credit. And a definition of literature is written works of superior or lasting artistic merit. And that does apply to some of the literature and some of the Australian literature of the Vietnam War, but not all. And unless Trump writes a non-fiction thing, we're unlikely to see the award of a Nobel Prize for Literature on the Vietnam War. What literature from previous wars in Australia, and I mean literary works in that sense that it's applied to fiction. I picked out my favourites from the Second World War. I think Bernard Cowanen's Independent Company was way ahead of many others. That Peter Ryan's Fear Drive My Feet was particularly so. And the trilogy written by Ray Parkin between 1960 and 1968 was particularly strong. We got anything like that from Vietnam War? Think about it. They're non-fiction, but they're of a very high quality of writing. Let me talk briefly about the new military history. Once upon a time, I run a military library. People think it's about generals and battles, but the new military history goes far broader than that and contains a treatment of the entire field of the military endeavour. It's had a methodological shift towards data-based stuff, and certain repositories, like the collection at Texas Tech, do help that. And it analyses things in context. Some of the Australian literature probably meets that criteria. Geoffrey Gray, the late professor at the Defence Force Academy, ran a similar seminar to this, and I've forgotten the date immediately. It was in the, I think, the 90s. And as a result of one single seminar of a couple of days, 3 books were published. These 3 books, one of them in the United States, which was quite remarkable in itself, the one in the centre. And they were the first to look at the subject of Australian literature on the Vietnam War. I stand in his footsteps, so to speak, and I'm humbled by what was written by people like Peter Pearce, Jeff Doyle and Geoffrey Gray in those 3 books. Go and have a look at them. They're really well worthwhile, and I can't do nearly as well. If we look at the categories of writing in Australia on the Vietnam War, obviously there are the official history. There are many personal accounts. Many personal accounts. There are unit souvenirs of the sort that's published by a unit, a battalion, or other unit, straight after their tour of duty to give to families. There's the long tan literature. Yes, it's variable. There's the subject of Agent Orange and the subject of PTSD, and that doesn't cover the full field. But those are some of the things that inspire people to write. I think the official histories we can be very proud of. The official histories in Australia represent an undertaking by the former patron of this organisation, Peter Edwards, who's actually online there. Thank you, Peter, for the work that you did in providing us with a firm basis, an authoritative basis, and a well-researched basis for our understanding of the Vietnam War. It's a huge effort spent over quite a long period of time, up until 1995. It was followed by some semi-official works, and I picked out 3 or 4 of those here, and some really good ones amongst them. First of all, Dr. Edwards' summary, a bit like some of the summaries of Bean and others, the First and Second World War. The authoritative search for tactical success in Vietnam from the Army History Unit, an organisation that has produced an excellent work in the past, and Tom's Destroy and Build in Foot Twee. He paid me for this. But at least I'll get an IOU. And the somewhat remarkable book by Peter Yule following up the medical history with semi-official status where the official historian wasn't consulted. Draw your own conclusion. I make this point that there is a distinction between stuff written immediately by people who have come out of battle and written later by those that are not necessarily inspired by personal experience. Personal experience is exceptionally valuable as first-hand information, but sometimes people need to stand back from the event and assess it properly. Let me give you some examples of that by my friend Mark Dappen, where he, at least in one of those 2 books, has taken some of the myths that have grown up about the Vietnam War in Australia and absolutely demolished them. And sadly those myths sometimes predominate, but they still exist, and I don't think they'll ever go away. Ernie Chamberlain, an intelligence officer during the Vietnam War and a Vietnamese linguist of the highest calibre, has done something that is necessary in these circumstances. And that's to look at the other side of the hill and the accounts written, in this case by D445 at the 33rd North Vietnamese Army Regiment that operated predominantly in the area of Phu Tuy where the Australians served. If you look at these, and they're generously put online, you will find that not only are they an accurate translation of the Vietnamese view of what happened, the North Vietnamese view of what happened, but they're painstakingly footnoted, underlined pain. Some of his footnotes are longer than the book, but they're necessary because there are 2 views of the war, particularly in Phu Tuy, and they're almost completely opposed. And to give an example, casualties in the Battle of Long Tan, a sad thing to make a comparison about. Australian casualties are fairly well known because they were announced straight away. Nobody knows the Vietnamese casualties, and there are many figures. And I could talk about that at quite some length. Indeed, while we're into Long Tan-alia, these are just some of the books. Note the dates about Long Tan with some of the people present here. It's an interesting but snapshot of a particular time in the war. The issues of honours and awards and those whose service was recorded attract a certain segment of the military history community. And putting the facts down, or the facts as they're known at the time, is particularly important. What can I say about subsequent books? Peter Edwards' summary book, Australia in the Vietnam War, is an excellent summary. It's biased towards Army to a certain extent, because sadly the contribution from the RAF and the RAAF was important, but one could say somewhat lesser. The Agent Orange remains, as Peter Yule has shown in The Long Shadow, a controversial thing. and that controversy still continues. I don't think that's the last word of the issue. Fiction on the Vietnam War in Australia forms a place. Let me just pause for a moment and say all of these books come from a particular collection, that's the library of the AUSI, where we endeavour to have a copy of each book written by Australians on the Vietnam War, and for that matter New Zealanders, but I don't have time for the Kiwis at the moment. Lex Macaulay wrote his book as David Alexander. He's written a lot of non-fiction on the Vietnam War as well. Take Underground, the graphic novel in 2021. That just shows that a modern generation is re-examining the Vietnam War, in this case, from the perspective of a wombat. There's a challenge. I referred earlier to the souvenirs that came out after particularly infantry battalions served in Vietnam. And the purpose of these books was to give the families an idea of what their husbands had gone through in Vietnam. And they form a part that they're quite hard to find in some instances, particularly the earlier ones, such as the Anzac Battalion in 1968, a 2-volume richly printed volume with maps and so on, but little really about the war rather than the bare facts. Certainly no interpretation. I call these sort of first generation books, and I don't want to denigrate them by calling them souvenirs because they play an important part in the memory. You'll note by the one from 106 back to the last one, 2016 for example, they still continue to be written. It's an amazing thing in itself. Then there are the books that purport to see the war in Vietnam in its complete overview. And indeed, the third book by Bruce Davies, The Complete Story of the Australian War. I'm reminded, of course, that book titles are sometimes decided not by authors, but by publishers so that they'll sell more. Clearly, no book could be the complete history of the Vietnam War. There have been several, these are just 3 of the many attempts to do that. I don't think they replace the official history. They're viewed as being more friendly to the reader. I haven't included any books by a particular author, and I'll say why. Then there were the second wave of books that followed, which reported the war from an Australian perspective and tried to interpret them to some extent. And they succeeded, I think, in taking the arguments and the discussions to a further level. There are several books, perhaps in the third wave, and this is one that I particularly recommend to you, and I think it certainly gets the star for being literature. It's written by an author most known for his fictional works, but a literary figure on the Australian scene. Gerard Windsor's book, with extensive interviews, realised the stress and trauma experienced by some veterans of 7RAR's Tet Battle in 1968, and he pierced some wounds which still bleed. And that's the effect that a well-written book can have. Then there are a bunch of books that have a bone to pick with the authorities. Ghost Platoon, for example, complains that nobody knows we ever existed. Sadly, the author of that book didn't really go and do his research. He worked from a gut reaction. Never mind, because a gut reaction is a valuable contribution to the knowledge of what happened in a war, even if it's not necessarily right. There was mention in passing of individual and unit replacement earlier. Mostly infantry battalions had unit replacement, but there were trickle feed replacements as well. And the worst effect of that were on the reinforcement units, noted by We Are Rios, dealing with that. There are now many histories of the smaller units in Vietnam. These are 4 of them. The nurses, the Army Aviation, a platoon history. There are, to my knowledge, about a dozen platoon histories. That one, the third one, is one of 2 volumes of about 300 pages, full of colour photographs and the details of every soldier in that platoon. And the fact that it came out in 2017, think about the age, it's quite remarkable. And logistic histories are starting to appear. In passing, here is a commercial grade saying what should be in a unit history. It certainly should have an index, and indeed if a non-fiction book doesn't have an index, it's almost useless for further researchers. It should have a nominal role, a difficult thing to do for the Vietnam War and an impossible thing to do for subsequent conflicts because of privacy. It should list casualties in awards. It should recommend you to a bibliography from where the information came. And it should have something about the other side of the coin, the enemy. I talked about personal narratives, and here are a dozen. I was tempted at the start to give them star rating. Some of those would have no stars, and some would have several. Some would approximate to 4 or 5. But let me say that that is a small sample over a period of time, starting in 2001 and extending to the present. It's an extensive volume of writing, tending in some occasions to be an expensive body of literature, 2 different things entirely. But nevertheless, each of those books has a value, and you can see some of the themes that are listed in it. Next slide. See if you can give me the next slide. And then you see it, this is an effect of regional research. Here's the veterans from the Yarra Valley in the Vietnam War. And this is the first that I've found of regional experiences of that particular conflict. It's quite common for the First and Second World War, very unusual for later campaigns.
Just give another try here.
Children's books on the Vietnam War. Do you know of any? Here are 2. Because there's a need to explain conflict to a juvenile audience. And these are just 2 of the several. And the question is, you've got to have relevance to kids. Now, pick one of these up if you like and have a look at it. See what it says, but more particularly see what it doesn't say. And the important question is, should the Vietnam War be part of the curriculum? And at what level? With what detail? There are those who are almost violently opposed to the way the Department of Veterans Affairs controls the narrative of children's or the curriculum's examination of conflict in Australia, be it from the First World War or subsequently. In passing, I mentioned Agent Orange, and there are several, but these are just a sample of the books on the Australian experience of Agent Orange. You can almost feel the heat coming out of some of these books, and justifiably so when you pick them up. But also, the amount of misinformation contained in those books is indicative of the quality of the research that has gone into another Agent Orange one. There is, I think, insufficient on the protest movement. My library believes that it should have books that are pro-government and anti-government and neutral and view from the winning perspective and the losing perspective. so that scholars in the future can make their own decisions. So books on the protest movement in Australia, whilst I wasn't part of it, and you may not have been part of it, are an interesting part of the story of the Vietnam War. The Fourth Estate is pretty well covered. Neil Davis was quite unusual, as mentioned, and Tim Bowden's a great writer. His experience was that he went with soldiers, both Australian and South Vietnamese, and got a far better perspective than many of the other correspondents whose method of getting news was to offer soldiers a bottle of scotch. There are several plays about the Vietnam War written in Australia of varying quality, I would say. Women's part, including that of the Fourth Estate, note where they're seeing glasses on the person on the right, is starting to be well documented. Particularly there's good literature on Australian nurses in Vietnam and nurses' participations in hospitals throughout Vietnam, independent of the task force. The medical profession is also reasonably well catered for. It was an interesting experience for a doctor to join, for example, an infantry battalion, or even more interesting for a gunner regiment, come to think of it, a bigger job. And they're very, very valuable, and particularly as they could foresee PTSD coming in many instances. The RMO of 7RA's first tour has a high position to play in psychiatry in New South Wales for a good reason. One of the more recent books is that account of a hospital, which should come in a forklift to lift the book. It's a very well-produced book about, and with that lovely call sign band. I like it. They've got a sense of humour as medical people. Battlefield Tourism, these are two of Gary Mackay's many books on the Vietnam War, is a reality. As some have mentioned, people go back to Vietnam and they face frequently interviews with those that have been their enemy. Staged or unstaged, question mark. Accurate or inaccurate, question mark. Controlled or uncontrolled, question mark. There are many question marks. But tourism to Vietnam, at least officially, is relatively easy. At the technical level of military experience, there are several very good books on analysing the tactics used by Australia and Vietnam, and these are just four of them. The first on the minefield, that most controversial event. I happen to disagree with a good deal of it, but it's a great contribution to that debate. Logistics, until recently, was an absolute black hole until the Australian Army History Unit published through Cambridge University Press the book on the right, which came out this year. And it's not in bookstores because Cambridge University Press is the worst distributor of books in Australia. The one on the left is particularly useful. It tells you how many rolls of toilet paper can be used by a task force in a month in operations, which is an excellent. There are other things in it besides toilet paper. It's quite rare. That might be the only copy in captivity, but it's important. Oops. I don't want to forget the Royal Australian Navy and the Royal Australian Air Force. And there are some now good accounts, particularly coming out from the Air Force, I must say, who have discovered their history and are starting to get it well written and distributed. These are again a small sample. Hello, Lambs. And the RAN and RAAF have been looked at in some detail. For example, the RAAF in the war in Vietnam, the one done by, or one of the seminars won by the RAAF, is particularly valuable to give you facts about what happened during the war. Biff Ward has come out with this. I I think it's probably safer for me not to comment. The question of re-acceptance is, and I use that term to refer to the general community acceptance that Vietnam service, or more particularly those who served in Vietnam, should be accorded a degree of respect. I agree with that. And various organisations and states have come up with books like this, reflecting that they've been welcomed back into the community. The ethics of involvement in the Vietnam War is a particularly interesting case, and one of our classmates, because there are 3 of us here today, has kindly written this book, which is a great examination of the dilemma facing soldiers, particularly those of a more religious persuasion, and it's an important part of the literature. VC winners, we have some, and there are biographies, some rare and unusual, and some slightly better, discussing what happened in particular sets of circumstances with the winning of VCs, and it's another theme. The theme of leadership, Australian leadership in Vietnam, I think is one that hasn't been sufficiently dealt with, but this is one attempt by a former commanding officer of one of the infantry battalions. Humour is part of military service, and there are several books of a humorous bent looking at when soldiers can laugh in circumstances that aren't laughable at all. Without doubt the worst book. Here is a book, Australians in the Vietnam War. If you open the cover, it doesn't have a date of publication, an ISBN, an author's name, or any other publications detail. It doesn't have an index, but you can buy it on the web, so it must be good. We have a copy in our library. One is tempted to jam the door open using this particular. Further research has indicated that it's either written by a man or a woman. And so let me abstract to what I consider Pete Stanley, that remarkable figure who used to teach the Defence Force Academy, came up with an expression, the green hole, dealing with the Second World War. He said there's a green hole about Australian operations, particularly in northern New Guinea during the Second World War. He was right at the time, the green hole has been filled in. What's lacking in Australian writing on the Vietnam War? Well, here's my opinion, it may or may not be right. But first of all, some problems. Desktop publishing means that you can write down everything you know, staple it together and get it printed and call it a book. It probably isn't. And vanity publishing is an aspect of that, where people take their son's diary to the local print shop and get it printed and bound. Nothing wrong with the content, but the fact that it doesn't obey the rules. There are no deposit copies. It probably doesn't say the year of publication, it doesn't get an ISBN, it certainly doesn't have an index. It means that for scholars, it has almost zero value. And vanity publishing allows that. We have some particularly good examples. Print on demand applies to that last thing that's jamming my door open. And publications that are only in digital form, I'm sorry, they're down. Digital format is great for certain circumstances, but serious researchers need a book open in front of them. The design of some books that have come out varies from very, very good, the Cambridge University Press books and those by Army History, and being good examples of it. They read all the things that they should read. However, there are so many others that don't, that they're unreadable because they've got the wrong typeface, and there are many other flaws. I mentioned ISBN. Books should have an index book, standard book number, And there should be deposit copies, and there should be by law. You give it to the State Library, the National Library, or else your damn book doesn't exist in a very short period of time. If you're going to write a book, make sure it has a future. And there are too many books written by strategic corporals who perhaps need to inform themselves better on some of the wider facts of the Vietnam War. Corporal Blogg's experience in every single war is valid for at least Corporal Blogg's and the bloke to his left, that two to his right. But it's a question mark about if he just writes from the head or from the heart, whether it's a valuable contribution to the literature on a particular conflict. The Green Holes, I mentioned only one regional biography of what happened to Vietnam veterans in the Yarra Valley. Biographies of commanders during the Vietnam wartime are few and far between. They're starting to leak out, and one of the attenders at this conference is a good example of where, and it will come up later on, so I won't steal his thunder. There's not enough about the other side of the war. Do we understand what our enemy was doing? Because war written from one side is one of. There aren't enough of what I call good third generation works. I don't have made that understandable. And last of all, I don't think there's sufficient cultural understanding of the area of conflict in which we fought. For example, on my first slide, I, as other speakers have done, put the diacritical marks on the Vietnamese language that was used. And it's like accents in French. Ignore them and you're being a cultural imperialist. That's just a small part of culture. But an understanding of the culture of the nation in which we fought is, I think, important. And last of all, there is insufficient, so far, in my view, discussion of the training that people undertook before going to that war in detail and in outline. That's my library. This is the commercial break. It's got a collection of 40,000 items within Victoria Barracks in that highlighted building, this building from the 1860s, currently under threat from the sale of Victoria Barracks. More particularly, its catalogue is on the net, and you can find it by going to the website. The catalogue of any organisation, particularly collecting organisation, is its key to worldwide access. Thanks very much.
We have time for one question.
Question, come observation, please. It seems to me that in your gap analysis, there are two major histories that ought to be written in this context. One is the headquarters of 1ATF, what's going on at Nui Dat, and one ALSG as a unit advantage. Those two histories don't seem to have been written, and I heard part of the reason is the commanders' diaries have got lost. Anyone?
Well, that last point is wrong.
Right.
Those commanders' diaries are digitised and available easily at the Australian War Memorial.
Right.
Yes, there is no overall story of the headquarters or of one ALSG. Yeah, it's part of the Green Gap.
It is a gap, yeah, I thought so. Thank you.
Okay, we might...
Mike goes to your question. Is your library open to the public?
Yes. It's open on Mondays and Thursdays. You have to make an appointment. There's certain hoops you have to run through because Defence lets you at the front gate. You write an email to the Secretary and we sort it out from there. The collection on Australia's role in the Vietnam War is extensive. It consists of books, maps, digital materials, and particularly leaflets, pamphlets and orders. And it's unit.
Thank you. just before we do break for afternoon tea, I'm not going to give Mike any books because he's got a library full of them. I just want to say to Mike, simply thank you for your service. Thank you for your service in Vietnam, but more importantly, your ongoing service to military history and heritage, not just in Victoria, but in Australia.